You know that 2018 Luzia study? You know, that one where 72 scientists confirmed her DNA matched the modern-day natives? You see, here's the thing with that, though. Before I jump into it, though, this is only for academic and educational purposes only. Everything I say in this video is backed by historical documents and my own research. Do your own research and use your own discernment. This is not misinformation, it's history through another lens. They never tested her bones. They never tested her actual bones. They tested several other bones around the same time period in the same area and assumed those results applied to her. However, that leaves a small margin of error, on top of the fact they use modern-day reference populations to compare her DNA to. Luzia's own remains were initially too fragile for DNA extraction. Scientists sequenced the genomes of 5 other individuals from the Lund collection who lived in the same region at a similar time. Let's go down to the second part. It says the genomic analysis proved these individuals were entirely Amerindian. They shared a common ancestor. So their proof is based on a common ancient ancestor, not a direct line. Here's what else they don't tell you. They only use federally recognized tribes to compare her DNA to. In the United States, researchers primarily use DNA from federally recognized tribes because these are the groups that have formal, legal, and ethical frameworks of genetic participation, exclusion of others. Tribes that are state recognized or unrecognized, as well as urban, quote-unquote, indigenous people who may not be enrolled are frequently left out of the data collection. You know what else they don't tell you? That same 2018 study, they detected an Australasian-like, formerly known as Australoid, genetic signal in ancient South Americans, and they called it Population Y. Population Y is a term they use to describe a mysterious signal they found in multiple ancient remains in Brazil, which share a significant amount of DNA to modern-day indigenous Australians. Is it possible that a group of humans related to Australian Aborigines somehow made its way into South America before the Native Americans crossed the Bering Strait and entered the New World over 13,000 years ago? In other words, were the first Americans actually the second Americans? In 2015, Dr. Reich and his colleagues found that some living people in the Amazon carry some DNA that most similar to that of people who live today in Australia and New Guinea. The researchers speculate that their ancestors include an unknown group which the scientists call Population Y, who separately made their way into the Americas. Let's go down to the underlying areas. It says Dr. Willeslev's team succeeded in identifying their DNA in some of the 10,400-year-old skeletons in Brazil. That means there was at least one other population in the Americas before the Siberian group. This is Richard Neves. He was the first person to reconstruct Luzia's face in 1999, and he did it using forensic methods that was used for decades. He used the Manchester method. This technique is widely considered one of the most reliable manual 3D reconstruction methods because it's combined 2 distinct approaches. And this is the original reconstruction of Luzia from 1999. Oh, and by the way, Neves argued for decades that Luzia, along with the Lago Santa skulls, showed morphological affinities similar to Australasians, Melanesians, and Africans. What are the Lago Santa skulls? Lago Santa's contribution to the origins and life of early Americans. Now, y'all can pause the passage. I'm just going to go down to the underlying red areas. Cranial morphology of Lago Santa skeletons allowed the proposition of a model of 2 biological components for the occupation of the Americas in which early Americans are morphologically similar to people of African and Austral-Melanesian origin. All right, now let's go down to the underlying areas. It says human skulls from South, Central, and North America attesting to a colonization of the New World by at least 2 different succeeding biological populations, an early one with a cranial morphology similar to that found today in the African and Australian continents. So basically, her skull that had African-like, Australian-like features were overruled by proxies. And that's not science, that's substitution. Population Y, which was found in the same region as Luzia's people, would explain her features. And remember, they didn't test Luzia herself, they only tested her peers. So population Y can very much be in her lineage, so they didn't rule it out, they just reinterpreted it. The shared ancestor trap. Researchers define Amerindian based on a specific set of Siberian descendant markers. They find those markers in Luzia, they declare Luzia entirely Amerindian, quote unquote, even if other signals like the Australasian one are present because those signals don't fit the predefined category. Luzia's face never changed, and population Y proves she could have been exactly what she looked like. Luzia to the left, and to the right, the 1791 emblem of America. Pay attention. And that's why those genetics and DNA tests are biased, because they only use federally enrolled tribes and automatically exclude the Black indigenous Americans because they assume that we come from Africa. If we are tested, we're automatically counted out. And here's why. Admixture studies, large-scale studies on African American genomics do find these markers. However, the standard scientific interpretation is to label this as admixture that happened after 1492 rather than evidence of a deeper original connection. Missing simple. Critics argue that many melanated or non-enrolled indigenous groups are systematically excluded from these studies, which leaves a massive hole in the data. Oh, and by the way, they couldn't further test Luzia's bone because in 2018, a fire destroyed an entire collection of more than 20 million historical pieces of Brazil's National Museum in Rio de Janeiro, including the 12,000-year-old fossil called Luzia. They saved what they could, but, they couldn't save much. Luzia's skull was being displayed in the fire, but copies had been made. Luckily, fragments of the skull were salvaged from the rubble. This happened the same year that 2018 study came out. Now, If you know me, I don't believe in coincidences. And here's why skull morphology holds more weight. When you prioritize the skull, the hardware, you aren't dealing with probabilities or population clusters. You are dealing with the actual scaffolding of a human life. Now let's go down to DNA. It says the DNA is a code that scientists run against modern people to see what usually happens. If the code says there's a 70% chance of certain nose shape based on modern Native Americans, they draw that nose, even if the actual bone in front of them says something different. Let's go down to the bottom. It says, by choosing the DNA probability, quote unquote, over the skull's reality, the 2018 researchers essentially voted against the evidence they could hold in their hands. They decided that their mathematical model of what an indigenous person should look like was more important than the physical features Nieves measured. The cranial morphology is a physical fact, not probabilities. Once again, they said that Luzia is a direct ancestor of the modern-day Native Americans because they share a common ancient ancestor. But that's not proof, because we all share a common ancient ancestor if we go further back enough. When you look at the other remains from the era, the evidence of a widespread melanated population becomes undeniable. And that's why we get articles like these, like the hill-based skeletons, in which they found 2 skeletal remains of black males that dated before colonization. We get articles like the Lagos Santos skulls that compare their skulls to those of African and Australasian skulls. Or we get articles like this: ancient skeletons provide substantial evidence of early existence of blacks, where scientists come out and say they found skeletal remains that closely resemble cranial of Negro groups coming from parts of Africa. Moreover, both scientists have labeled as Australoid, a variant of the black race, skeletons unearthed along the Pacific coast in California and Lower California that represents the most ancient human remains thus far discovered in the New World. Skeleton of these early blacks have also been discovered in Central and South America. Griffin Taylor, for example, speaks of the most ancient human skulls of Brazil and Ecuador as indicating the presence in the far past of Negroes people in the American continent. Then it goes on to say on the other highlighted part, it says sculptures of the human face and from dating back to the archaic and pre-classical periods of Mexico, Central, and South America bear unmistakable characteristics of black or African people. Articles in journals of anthropologists and scientists confirming their findings. So, is the 2018 study a scientific fact? No, it's not. It's a series of estimates, assumptions, interpretations, and probabilities based off modern-day reference populations. They admit they use modern groups. They admit they didn't test Luzia herself. They admit they skewed certain groups from the study. They also admit that they share a common ancient ancestor, not a direct line. So once again, it's an assumption built on interpretations limited by samples and presented as certainty. And this is why several bioarchaeologists and paleoanthropologists still argue that cranial morphology, the study of skull shape, remains an essential irreplaceable source of data, contending that the physical direct record of the bone cannot fully be replaced by the statistical models based on modern DNA. So once again,